language.
Hello and welcome to the Happy Musicians Podcast, where it's not about getting the gig, it's about enjoying the gig. I'm your host, Tanner Guss, and this week I am joined by Monika Herzig. Monika is a wonderful pianist, composer, and band leader. She's got her own record label and has released over a dozen records under her own leadership. She's a historian with published books on the life and works of David Baker and Chick Corea, and she teaches music business and entrepreneurship at the IU School of Public and Environmental Affairs. A lot of our conversation focuses on the research that she's done in the history of all-female groups and the important role they've played in developing young female jazz musicians. We talk about how developmental psychology, instrumental choices, and practices within the music community have negatively impacted the matriculation of young female musicians. And we talk about the gender imbalance in university faculty positions and in the instrumental Grammy categories. Several amazing musicians have been recognized in the vocal category, like Ella and Diane Reeves and Sarah Vaughan, and multi-instrumentalists like Diana Krall and Esperanza Spalding. And of course, Maria Schneider has several awards, but in the instrumental categories, I think it's just Terry Lynn Carrington, Tia Fuller, and now Melissa Aldana, with Terry Lynn being the only one to win. And that's just so many amazing female instrumentalists throughout the history of Black American music and jazz music that have been unrecognized, and that's just incredibly unfortunate. Before I launched the podcast, I reached out on Facebook and questioned my community about who they think the artists in their lives who have this spark of positivity and bring this light to the world are, and there were a ton of amazing responses, but like almost entirely male suggestions, and I reached out to a fellow musician of mine, asking her if she had any suggestions for female musicians I should have on the show. And she said that it's hard, one, because there just aren't as many women pursuing this, and two, they go through a lot of mental stress trying to fit in and usually end up with a tough skin because of it. So normally I try not to focus on the gender-based experiences of guests, but I think this conversation outlines several important factors affecting the happiness of our musical sisters and offers new actions we can take as a community to better support each other. So I hope you enjoy, I hope you learn something I know I certainly learned a lot, and please help me welcome Monika Herzig. Monika Herzig, welcome to the Happy Musicians Podcast.
Glad to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, absolutely. I am excited to talk to you today because we're going to talk about the role of all female groups. And normally I try not to make this kind of female musician title that we like to throw around the focus of interviews that I have, but since it's something that you've researched, I thought that we could go deeper into it and understand it better and talk about the benefits of it and some of the things working against it. And you informed me with this article or chapter of a book that you're writing, and I'd like to talk about that as much as we can today. So maybe you could share with the listeners this work and research that you've done about the role of all female groups.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So something that, well, being a female instrumentalist myself, obviously it's something I've been interested in ever since I started playing. Mm-hmm. And then 5 years ago, I started a group of all female musicians, mostly out of New York, who are great players, because over time, I saw a need in showcasing these musicians that I think have not been recognized as they should. And then leading the group, which was quite successful, and we have some albums out, I realized there's still a discrepancy between how people perceive of such a group and which audiences come versus really the level of musicianship that some of them have. Mm-hmm. And, of course, now we've been in the Me Too age, and we had a big revolution and opening of eyes. and it kind of swept along like a wave, like look at look at all these things happening. And by now it seems we're already nearly tired of, okay, this topic again. Do we really still have to talk about it? We have all these great women players. So I thought, there was a reason I did this, and I want to dig a little deeper and find out what actually is the role of these all-female groups.
Yeah.
Why do we need them? Why is it important to do that beyond? It's not a gimmick. Why is it important?
Mm-hmm. One thing you wrote was that it's the ever-emerging title. Like, it's this phenomenon that keeps coming up of like, oh, all-female groups, but they've been going on for most of the history of jazz. And maybe you could talk about the origins of them and the history and some prevalent groups that have shaped this ever-emerging phenomenon.
So, I mean, women have been part of the history of jazz from the beginning. They were always great players. And, especially in a town like New Orleans, you had this piano tradition. There were great pianists in some of these places. But they never became part of the telling of history. And there's several reasons. It was not a socially acceptable thing to do. And it was not even safe to be part of a scene like that and travel like this. So it didn't become really part of history. And there were some great all-female groups. For example, the Sweethearts, the International Sweethearts of Rhythm, actually came out of an orphanage, and was a group that was formed in an orphanage, all-female group. And
wow.
They went on the road, and the girls realized, how much they wanted to play and perform, and finally had an opportunity to do that. They didn't want to go back to the school, so they just kind of jumped ship and and stayed, against a lot of resistance from the teachers, but they just didn't return, and then hired on some other musicians from New York and larger cities, and there were other groups like that, not necessarily with that story.
Right.
And then especially during the Second World War times, a lot of these groups actually were very prominent touring groups because the men were at war and they couldn't be musicians, so there was place and space, and they toured a lot of the stations and bases and were well acknowledged. And then by the time everybody got back from being a soldier, they claimed their places as musicians back, and those all-female groups disappeared. So they were there, and they're always part of history, but obviously we don't know them. We don't see them in the history books. And so it's always become this emerging phenomena. Oh, here's a all-female group, how special.
Yeah.
But not realizing, no, they've always been there. There's just been this issue of not having them part of our history. And what that has caused is this ever missing of role models, of seeing others that do what you do, that you could follow. And so it's always been this marginalized group, those few who prevail through trying to improvise in puberty, through getting instruments assigned that are supposed to be for the girls, through all the competitive. There's always a few that will emerge and are strong enough, but then they're always in the minority. So one thing that, it's just the time with the Me Too movement is just to see, can this 100-year-old emerging field finally become something that's not emerging anymore and get equalized.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you hit a couple things that maybe we could explain a little bit more, and one of them were two of the things that early on affect the rate that young female musicians continue to do music, and one of them is the kind of the psychological impediments of improvising at a young age. So we could talk about that.
So, the psyche of girls in puberty, which is between ages 12 to 16, right, is very different from the boys in puberty. I mean, that's just the nature of things. I mean, we can't deny it. So for girls at that time, they very much need to be part of a group, and inside, taking risks and being outside is not something they do. You could, and when we introduce improvisation in schools, it's right around that time in middle school.
Right, which is kind of based entirely on taking risks and
which means
being vulnerable.
Right, you're teaching and you're asking, hey, somebody wants to take a solo, which means you have to step up front in front of your peers and try something that's risky and probably doesn't sound perfect or good, and kind of in front of your peers leaves you in the open and possibly laughed at. And no, or very few girls in puberty would dare to do that. Most of them will freeze and, kind of not even react. While for boys, in puberty, it's kind of the time to show off and kind of flex your muscles.
Right.
and become the boy that can protect others. So they will go, me, and give it a try. And so it's starting to be this great divide, and it's not against teachers. I mean, it's just the nature of things that, of course, you will groom those who keep volunteering and get better at it. And so by high school, those who have been at it are the ones that are the great soloists. When you go to competition, the ones you can show off. And the girls who have been hiding probably hang on for a little longer. They'll play in the ensemble, but eventually just drop out. But, little by little, that divide just gets bigger.
Well, it kind of gets exponential with each step up, because you get better opportunities because you were more inclined to improvise earlier, which is really unfortunate. And do you think there are certain practices that we could implement as a community at that age to foster these musicians and help keep everyone feeling comfortable and on a more level playing field?
So, you pretty much hit it already, make them feel comfortable.
Yeah.
So, any teacher or anybody that's in a situation where you foster at that age group, it's just important to keep in mind to provide these opportunities where everybody gets to do something in a safe way. So it doesn't even feel like, I'm stepping forward and doing something different, but just making sure to always keep it inclusive. Let's just all take, a blues chorus. And
instead of having people have to volunteer, it's just like, okay, we're all going to do this.
Let's
now.
all do this. Or today, all of the saxes are going to do, and then tomorrow, next rehearsal, all of the trumpet players. So just keeping in mind that, A, make sure everybody gets to do it, and B, don't make it anything special. It's just, you just have to, we'll just do this.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. And the other one that you mentioned was instrument choice, which can be gendered, right?
So still, most likely, there's associations, the girls, you play the flute and the violin, and you still have more girls ending up with string instruments in the orchestra side of things versus the wind instruments. So even finding ways of just being inclusive in terms of instruments too early on, when you have ensembles, and having some space for the flutes and the violins too to be part of it.
Yeah.
Or just early on being really conscious about offering the whole palette,
Okay.
making sure there's not any inclination of assigning things just because.
Yeah, absolutely. So these all female groups are, as you explain, are a great way to address some of these issues and create a comfortable environment for female musicians, right?
So there's some psychological effects when it's called tokenism.
Right.
And then I also mention in the chapter a recent book called Whistling Vivaldi, And this is by an African-American author who looked into this issue of being a minority in majorities and expectations and what that does. And he came to this idea from a friend who told him this story, a friend who was a professor at a university, but in the evening he would walk home, I think it was Chicago streets, and often realized when he was walking home, just because he was a black male, people would be suspicious or stop conversation when he come or change the side of the road, just assuming he probably might be dangerous. And then he thought about it, and he started, when he was walking home, just whistling Vivaldi music, which kind of told people hearing that, oh, this is not your regular person. This is an educated person. He knows Vivaldi. He knows classical music. And he noticed a change, and people suddenly not having to switch the side of the road and things like that. And so he was looking at this issue. What is it about these expectations just from the look of something? And there were some experiments where they put groups of students, all female students, in a room and gave them a math test. And one group saying, well, this is to test, your math ability to score. And the other group, it was just, oh, yeah, we just need a baseline on things. It's nothing special, meaning one was under the pressure of performing high or performing, and it was graded. The other was just for fun. And those under the pressure of having to perform always performed much worse, because they just felt immediately, well, we're all girls, we can't do this is math, we're probably...
They were told, right, that they were being tested on a gender basis. Yeah, and they performed worse as a result.
Meaning that pressure, when there's expectations, you might underperform at what you normally do. Yeah,
which is, reading that statistic was really scary to see. It's really unfortunate, and you can attest to this probably, is that the feeling that you can get being often the only female musician in an entire big band,
So, right, that's... often if you come in as the only one, you always feel that pressure. And I'm sure I screwed up so many things just because I thought I have to really, really do this right. And and you get uptight and you just don't perform to the level you could. So something that, you have in this all-female environment is that you can loosen up those pressures. So you open up higher levels of performance in oftentimes and have this safe space. So I think that's a really important role, at least for a while, until you start getting into environments where it's just half and half or whatever. It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
And this pressure kind of goes away.
That makes a lot of sense. And how do these all-female groups work with this term tokenism? How does it address that?
So the tokenism idea, meaning if you're one among many, again, you have always this pressure of performing at a super high level on you because your expectations initially when you enter the situations are lower. And I can attest to that. Just a few weeks ago, I was playing for the Indie Jazz Fest up at the Jazz Kitchen and performed with Kathy Morris, actually, so not the only one. And we had a great set. I'd go off the stage, and this gentleman in the first row was all excited. Says, "Oh, you sounded great. You were wonderful." And then he said, I really didn't expect that. You look like a school teacher. And then my heart just went down and said, well, this is okay. So what actually did you expect just by looking at me, So it's still, somebody looks at me and expects something different, and then that makes makes it harder. But it was interesting, and it's, just a few weeks ago.
Yeah, that's unfortunate. And being in an all-female group, do biases like that, visual biases and stuff, come into play in the same way? Or what's your experience with the perception that you receive?
So, I mean, playing-wise, it's a safer environment. I mean, the whole dynamics of interacting with each other, it's really wonderful. I really enjoy it. For going into different situations, I do see different audiences. Like the hardcore jazzers, they kind of stay away. For them, it's still, oh yeah, this is just a gimmick group, but not to be taken seriously like the serious jazzer. So I see different demographics in terms of listeners, but yeah.
And one thing that you talked about in the book, or the chapter, sorry, that was this idea that has kind of been a counter movement to the importance of these groups, which is this post-feminism sentiment. And maybe you could explain that.
So something that we saw, after the whole feminist movement in the 60s, 70s, where we had a lot of equalization and freedom, and, was hippies, was great. And, and then in the 80s, 90s, it was kind of a drawback, and you saw in a lot of the females that attained some power or were in strong positions, putting this whole notion aside of it's not because I'm female and it doesn't matter, I'm just like the same as everything else, and not wanting to talk about this. And what that came from was kind of some pressure of society of, let's put this aside and not talk about it. But what it does, it again puts it into the tokenism category and puts you, and a lot of females put them in more a competitive position. I'm the powerful one and I need to succeed. And so it's kind of an anti-movement to make it weaker again, because now it's the lonely woman again.
Yeah.
And it was interesting. We saw that a lot with the great female musicians. I had some examples where when Terry Lynn Carrington won her first Grammy, and they were interviewed, and it was Ingrid Jensen and Tia Fuller and her and some others in the room, they completely shut down and just said, we do not want to talk about this. We don't even mention women in jazz. We're just great musicians. And the same musicians, just 10 years later, are the ones at the front of the, let's talk about this, let's do a change. And Terry Lynn Carrington founding at Berkeley this center for gender and jazz that she's leading now. Meaning, obviously, something changed in those 10 years.
Yeah.
And it was this, realizing, no, we've been pitted against each other to, no, we have to bond, and there's more strength working together.
Yeah. It would be one thing to completely ignore the title of a female musician if it was truly equal, but statistically it's just not.
Right. So obviously the statistics, there's something, so it's not equal, so we can't just ignore it and say, the strong ones, the good ones will prevail. Well, it's not that there's less capability, there's some other reasons why there's unequal numbers.
Yeah, and just because we're making progress doesn't mean we're there, and that we should lighten up the efforts, right? And some things you talked about that I thought were really interesting, some statistics that weren't necessarily interesting, more disheartening, but the full-time jazz faculty percentage is 90% male, and I think still to date there's only one Grammy Award nominated, won by a female instrumentalist, right?
So, right. Well, and then Maria Schneider as a big band leader, as a composer, she had one Grammy once, but that's very few. So in instrumental full-time jazz faculty, if you look around at schools, think about it. How many can you name of full-time instrumental professors?
Yeah, not a lot, unfortunately.
And I mean, there's a lot of jazz programs
Yeah.
in the country, but I mean, it's a handful, a few.
And you talk about how in the classical world they've made efforts to address this by doing blind auditions and screenings, and it led to a large increase in the number of female hires and helped to create a more gender equal ratio, right? But practices like that have not been seen in the jazz world. And there's actually certain practices in the hiring process in the jazz world that there aren't even official job postings a lot of times, and it's pretty much a brotherhood kind of thing of your good friends that you'd like to invite to come work at this school.
And, you know, it makes sense out of the tradition of how jazz bands works. I mean, you have a very intimate relationships when you play with others, right? You have to go on the stage together and create. And if you do that with somebody you don't like or you're not comfortable with, that's tricky, right?
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
So, I mean, it makes a lot of sense. Of course, you hire your friends and the people you feel comfortable with first. But, you know, it's a cycle it's actually the same cycle as in the business world, too. That's why you see the same thing. It's the same problem that if you work in a company, you want to work with your colleagues that you feel comfortable with. So you hire your friends and the ones that are like you first. So it takes a conscious breaking of that cycle. And that's what affirmative action is for, you know, and some really don't like it. They say, well, you shouldn't hire or get somebody just because they are white or female or black or whatever over others that are also competent. But it is actually the only way to break a cycle. So it takes those few times where if you have choices, then to say, well, let me hire the person first that's from the minority group just to change the dynamics and give that a preference.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you will never break that cycle. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's really important, too. I'd like to maybe just talk about if you have certain practices that you think as a whole the jazz community could take on to be more supportive and conscious of the experience of female musicians. And
so one super important thing that I think is creating as many role models as possible.
Okay.
So I am actually for somewhat affirmative action, especially in educational institution. I think there's a vicious cycle that needs to be broken, and there should be an effort to have at least one or two of the instrumental teachers being female. Whatever it takes. And it doesn't mean you should give advantage to some that are not as qualified. It just means to cast the web wider, because I'm sure there's enough qualified ones somewhere.
Putting in a nice conscious effort to find
them.
Someone who is qualified and who'll do a great job.
And be more open. And I think that'll already entice a lot of change. You know, something that came out in the Me Too movement is, especially in educational institutions, it is a bit dangerous, you know, if you do that. And unfortunately, there was enough examples that were unveiled where it was just taken advantage of, you know, of having a powerful group at the top that bonds together.
Yeah.
And things getting hidden and things, using your power to do bad things.
Right.
And unfortunately, I know examples, you know, as close as possible of students or that have confided in me because, you know, they can trust me, but they would not in male faculty. So that's just a fact, and that's one thing. It can be broken one way.
Right. And these role models can serve as offering personal advice to these people and having gone through it, but also a big part of it is this visual bias or stereotype that can be created in your head of what you perceive to be an instrumentalist on your instrument. If you're never seeing any female musicians, it's hard to imagine yourself being in that cohort.
And the more you see it, those little things like what happened to me at the Jazz Kitchen will go away because it's just normal. Oh, yeah, whatever.
Yeah.
They're all great musicians. And we see it more and more happening, but it still needs that conscious effort. And then on stages, so same in educational institution and same on stages, just to make sure, it's not like, I know a lot of my colored fellows have been complaining that February they get all the opportunities because it's Black History Month, and then the rest of the year it's back to normal. And same, March is Women's History Month, and so we'll showcase, and the rest of the year it's back to normal. But just making a conscious effort, every month should have this big mix of things and thinking about the programming and what you put on stage. The European Jazz Festival Organization has just put out this mandate of by, I think it's in 10 or 15 years, it's supposed to be half and half. So all the festivals are working towards that mix, and some are more or less happy about that.
Right.
Because so I just actually talked to some of them. I was in St. Petersburg this weekend in Russia and just ran back, and they had their meeting there, so I got to talk with some of them, and they were like, well, I mean, in theory, I'm all for it, but I'm not sure this is the right level to attack this. So they feel, it should be attacked from the bottom first to grow those competent musicians, and then they can change their stage setup.
Right, that seems somewhat counterintuitive because part of the process of becoming quote-unquote competent enough is to have had those experiences in the first place. Right.
It's that vicious cycle thing. Yeah. So, you just have to break the cycle at all places. So I think it's a good thing. And, some of the other social structures also is, traditional jazz is learned. You go out, you hang with your buddies, you go to jam sessions and and do all that. And sometimes I didn't have as many opportunities as I wanted to do that.
Yeah.
And then especially when you get to age starting a family, you can't just run out every night and hang till 2:00.
Yeah.
And that's a time where you start missing on these things, and I don't know how that can be broken or done. I don't know how you would have felt if your mom would have run every night to a jam session and hang out till 2:00.
Yeah, would have been different at the Guss household.
It would have been different, right? And same here. And actually, unfortunately, I did probably way more of that than most others. And my kids are going, well, my mom was never there.
Right.
But that's a give and take, and that's unfortunately something that you have to grapple with. And I know some of my colleagues in the group at some point made a conscious decision not to start a family because they realized, it would not work in parallel, and they would have been the one that loses out on some things. Yeah. Because it seems like every female instrumentalist that I know ends up marrying a jazz musician.
Right.
I guess it's just the work environment that you're in.
Right.
But then, you always have the dynamics of both of you for the same career. Right. And with some it works out more or less, but mostly you still end up being more at home than probably your partner because it's just easier with the logistics.
Right.
And for a lot of male musicians, not all of them are married to jazz musicians, actually very few of them then. And so that's a different dynamic. So lots of them will have probably good jobs, which gives more flexibility in terms of doing things, and different work hours, And so there's a little social hurdle that often still comes in the way, and you have to grapple with it.
That's really interesting. I was aware of it, but maybe not consciously. Of just how many of the female musicians
Well,
I
think
know are
about all
married
the
to
ones
or
that
dating.
were in the program. I mean, they all ended up dating or marrying others.
Yeah, this is very true.
Well, at least the ones that I can think of.
Yeah, that's pretty wild. Is there any other advice that you like to offer to maybe young male musicians who are coming up alongside female musicians, and how to be aware of the situation that they're in and be supportive?
I would say just really treat them as good friends, and always be supportive. I mean, not overly, but just as good friends, like you would treat any other good friends, and be support and include them, as much as you can. And if you see others not treating them that way, speak up for them, and help out.
Yeah.
But I think that's the best you can do. But just being inclusive, speaking up, and being good friends, supporters.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, thank you.
And talking to them like you would talk to your buddies.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not that difficult.
Well, when I think I put that example in the book chapter when I first got to Alabama. And I have to say, I'm probably a generation before that. So for me, it's maybe a little stronger than most of the ones coming up now.
Okay.
But, when I first got there as a young undergrad, just starting my master's at the University of Alabama, I was late 80s and no, just 15, right? No,
Yeah.
And we had a band, and the drummer and the bass player were freshmen, I think, or sophomore from there. And I just realized in some of the rehearsal, I started to realize they had a really difficult time grappling with how they should address me, because I was just really different for them. I talked differently. I was white, and I was female and from somewhere else in a different language. So, and my then boyfriend, now husband, he was there, and so they would address him with questions or things
Yeah.
to ask me. And first I was really annoyed, and I just realized, they just don't know how to talk to me, how to behave normal next to me, because they don't know.
Right.
So just be normal. Don't think there's anything.
I'm just imagining you just yell like that. Just be normal, guys. Just be normal.
Yeah, well, it just, it was just really difficult for them. They
Yeah.
just didn't know, what
Yeah.
they should do. Just insecurity. I
Yeah,
mean,
that's a funny awareness that you had of their situation, that they weren't necessarily meaning to make you uncomfortable. They just didn't know what to do.
No, they just were insecure. They just didn't know how to behave, and that just, so for them it's more comfortable playing with the buddies, and that makes sense. And then they know how to crack jokes, and
Yeah.
otherwise they, can I say this? Can I not?
That's funny. Well, those are all the questions I have. If you don't have anything else in mind, we can move on to our CODA question round.
All right.
Cool. So
I'm ready.
The 5 short answer questions we do on each show before we take the CODA and get out. And the first one is, what is your go-to feel-good album?
So my all-time favorite is Chick Corea's Light as a Feather. And I was going to say Chick Corea, right?
Yeah, of course.
Because I'm the biggest Chick Corea nerd.
Yes, this is very true.
I ended up putting a whole book on him together because I had to.
Yeah, that's so cool.
Put that all in writing. But this is just, I think, just a real feel-good album of super high-quality tunes and compositions and playing together. And
yeah, absolutely. The next one is, what's a piece of advice about happiness that you've really enjoyed that you've received?
So I think, one of the things that's most important is knowing how to dodge the pressure of feeling overwhelmed. You know, there's always so many things you should be doing and should get done. And one of the things that I finally realized that make me like not being dodged down on all the time was thinking, oh gosh, I didn't get everything done that I needed to get done today, and keep working until you fall over. Is somebody said, no, you should always like take one thing and finish it.
Yeah.
And then go to the next thing. And then you always have this sense, oh, I just finished this, I accomplished something. Let me tackle the next thing, instead of trying to always balance these 5 different things in one place.
Yeah.
And it'll make you feel much more balanced and in tune, and yay, I did this.
I like that a lot. Then on the flip side, what advice would you give to young musicians that you think would be helpful?
So, you know, something that's tricky when you start out is to figure out who you are, what exactly is your voice, and what can you contribute.
Yeah.
And, you know, one great thing, especially while you're a student, you have, and no student believes me, but you have so much time to practice, you will never have that much time to practice again.
Yeah.
Right? So once you get out, you know, you have
think,
to do all these other things.
I won't have classes, it'll be time to practice, but turns out you're doing all these other things during that time.
Now you have to make a living and get all these real life responsibilities. So believe me, use that time and learn as much as you can. This will be the golden time to do that. And you know, by finding your voice, then always follow your gut. If something just doesn't feel right, or it doesn't feel like the right thing to do, then it probably isn't. And that's kind of hard to learn and figure out too, but there's something to it, you know, instead of saying, well, I've just because I should be playing in this dance band because it makes a lot of money.
Yeah.
And go on this gig or thing, but you know, every night I get home I just feel completely depressed and I hate it. Well, then just don't do it, you know. Then figure out what makes you feel good, because you'll be spending, and this is for any job, you know, you're spending a lot of hours doing this every day, and if it doesn't make you feel right and good, you know, why would you?
Yeah, that's really great. Who's a musician in your life who you think lives a particularly happy, healthy, and fulfilling life as a musician?
That's that's a tricky question. I kind of want to assume I hope I'm doing sort of that.
Well, that's why you're on the show.
Meaning, you know, finding a way to mix things so it works and you can pursue what you like. Somebody that I keep watching is one of my fellow Sheroes, is Lainey Stern, guitarist.
Okay.
And it's kind of funny because she's always been sort of my role model. You know, she's German and she came here and obviously made a great career, and I never thought, you know, I would get ever close to her, and eventually she's actually a bandmate, which is really, really great.
Yeah.
But I love the way she just really approaches things with this happy, healthy attitude and figures out a way of doing her thing. And, you know, she's married to Mike Stern, who's one of the greatest guitarists in the world, and a fellow guitarist, so it would be easy to be overshadowed and and be the wife of Mike Stern. But she doesn't let that happen. So she has, of course, somewhat privileged, you know, environment of having the name and the thing to go back to, but not being disturbed by anything. So I would put her up
Cool. Yeah, and then the last one is, what do you think your purpose as a musician is?
So I want to think my mission is to develop this language, this musical language, in a way that I can communicate on this level with people of music, meaning words can say some things, but when you say things with music, it's a different emotional level that you can reach that words just don't have. You know, you can talk about it. So when I write or arrange or do my own music, I want to communicate in a way that reaches this emotional level and makes people feel, think about something away from just using plain regular language.
Yeah, I love it. Yeah, that's all great. Before we're done, if you want to take a moment now, you can plug any products that you have or places online you'd like to send people, or projects that you want people to be aware of.
So you can just come to website with my name. That's Monika with a K, Monika, last name Herzig, HERZIG.com. And there's lots of things. Of course, my Sheroes group, we're working on a new project that will be out March 2020. And we'll be on tour with that. That'll be the third album, and then we have the previous ones. And then my fun project is my fusion group, The Time Flies, where we rock it out, and we'll come to New Orleans in January and be in the clubs. And
Nice. It's during the Gen conference? Sweet.
We'll have some outside of the Gen conference.
Yeah, cool.
Things. And, on the website, there's also the books on Chick Corea and David Baker and things to find. So
Yeah, great.
come to the great website.
Well, thanks so much, Monika. I really enjoyed it. Thanks for sharing.
Thank you.
All right, that does it for this week's episode of the Happy Musicians podcast. The featured track is Nancy Wilson Portrait, a composition by Monika based on the birthday of Nancy Wilson, and it's on her latest Sheroes project release. You can find the link to it and everything else that we talk about in the show at our website, thehappymusicians.com. You can also stay up to date by following us on social media at The Happy Musicians. You can follow us, subscribe to the show, and you'll know about new episodes immediately. And you can give us a rating and a review in whatever podcast app you use. And that goes a long way in helping us spread this message and reach new audiences and help other musicians get an extra dose of positivity in their day. We also want to encourage you to use our hashtag #HappyMusician on any posts you have that you're doing about your music. And thank you so much for taking the time and attention out of your day to listen to this podcast and better understand what our sister musicians are going through. And I think it's important to say that as the majority, it's up to us, men in the field, to be more compassionate and understanding and supportive and do everything that we can to be good friends and treat female musicians as equals and as normal people. Remember, just be normal. Thanks so much. Hope to see you again next week, and stay happy.